Ah, nice. How about we start the day with some drama? So today we are talking about the aforementioned question from our title and thumbnail of this video, which is whether or not Dragonflight was rushed to be released, and if it has been, did we notice anything that would confirm this hypothesis? So why this has been a question in the last couple of days was due to this chap right here, Brian Birmingham. This chap, until a few days ago, used to be the WoW tech lead for Classic WoW, and he has just now left Blizzard Entertainment under protest after refusing to give out an undeservedly low employee evaluation in order to fill competitive stack ranking quotas required by executive leadership. So he was, as he pointed out himself, the guy in charge to manage other people, to be responsible for their performance evaluation within a team of developers, to make sure that everyone is pulling their weight and there are no weaklings or people not putting nearly as much effort in their work. So that was his job. Unfortunately, what happened to him, to his team, and to Blizzard developers as a whole was the existence of stack ranking quotas. Now, let's go through a TLDR, a very simple explanation, and let's just turn it into WoW terms. Imagine you have to make a tier list. Imagine you are the guy who has to make a tier list of all of the specs in the game, except the game is your job and the specs are your employees. The problem is that you can't just make the tier list you want. For example, it just so happens that all of the specs in your game are balanced very well, so many or most of the specs are going to be in the A tier and in the B tier. There are going to be very few specs in the D or F tier because, the game is working quite well, the specs are working quite well, so there is no need to put that many or any at all down there. Unfortunately, that's not how stack ranking works. Unfortunately, this type of ranking, you might know this if you, for example, hail especially from the US, if you have gone through your colleges and your universities, you might be very aware of your bell curve rating system for your papers at universities and colleges. You might have had a paper that was very easy and everyone had answered all the questions correctly, but because the college you go to required the bell curve system to work, the professor had to invent ways to make some of the answers incorrect to some of the students so that he could fail them or rank them lower than others so that he could fulfill the bell curve system. The stack ranking quotas work in a very similar way. It doesn't matter if everyone is performing very well, there still need to be better employees than others. Going back to talk about it in WoW terms, imagine you have 10 players and all of them complete their at least +20 key in time, which is very good, right? Great, good job. Unfortunately, that's not how stack ranking works. If you had to stack rank them properly, you would have to put the two guys who completed a +21 in the S tier, and then the two guys who completed a +20 of Algetar Academy and of Azure Vault at the A tier, because those are pretty difficult dungeons, and then two more guys who completed a +20 of Jade Serpent and Halls of Valor into the B tier, and then the two guys who got Jade Serpent and Ruby Life Pulse into the C tier, and lastly the two guys who got the easiest dungeons done at +20, Court of Stars and Boiler Grounds. You would have to put them all the way down into the D tier. Even though they all did a pretty good job and they should all get their A tier for completing a +20, you have to rank them that way, because that's how a stack ranking system works. And that was clearly a problem for our technical lead over here, Brian Birmingham, because these type of quotas were often the cause of having himself to be forced to lower an employee's evaluation to a different ranking, to a different tier, for example, from successful to developing. Which is a pretty bad thing, as Brian points out, because being forced to lower an employee's evaluation down by a tier, for example, from successful and bringing it down to developing, is a pretty bad change, because it's going to change their profit sharing, it's going to change how much revenue they make, how much income they make based on the rating they get, as well as affecting their likelihood for future promotions, for example. This is something he was not comfortable with, which is what brought him eventually to leave the company in protest. He has been quite open about it. It all started as an article, as an uncensored article without mentioning his name, but then he took it upon himself to go on Twitter and create a whole thread long worth of explanation on the situation, and then he updated the thread with even more information about the situation. Where does our actual title come in? Because up to now we have just been talking for a while without actually mentioning the point in question, which is the mention of Dragonflight being rushed as an expansion. So in one of his last few tweets, he was pointing out that ABK, Activision Blizzard King, is a problematic parent company as they put us under pressure to deliver both expansions early. It is deeply unjust to follow that by depriving employees who worked on them for their fair share of profit. The ABK team should be ashamed of themselves. So he's pointing out after all of this that the couple of expansions developed at the time from 2021 to now, being as mentioned Dragonflight and Wrath Classic, were pushed out. They were rushed to be released by putting, of course, the developers under pressure, which also, of course, caused them to be even more tightly rated, which also forced them to have situations like the ones Brian mentioned about having to be put in a situation where he's forced to rate employees at a lower rating because that is what the stack ranking quotas require. Interestingly enough, just to mention this, Activision Blizzard might or might not, we're still waiting on this, might be acquired by Microsoft sooner or later. Interesting that Blizzard implemented this ranking system in 2021 while at the same time Microsoft abandoned this stack ranking quota system by 2013. So not only have they gone almost a decade without this system, but if they were to take over Blizzard, it might be quite likely that they would also remove this type of system from Blizzard altogether. The other last thing worth pointing out before we actually and finally start talking about Dragonflight is the fact that Brian Birmingham is pointing out that very likely this came from a pretty high executive level, all the way up in the Activision suits levels, and not, very likely, not from Mike Ybarra, for example, the president of Blizzard. It is something that came from a little bit higher up than just that. So now, finally, after a gigantic preamble, we find ourselves in front of the question about Dragonflight being rushed, being pushed out of the door earlier than expected. This leads us, of course, to looking around now, looking around at everything we just played in the expansion and wonder which of the things we just went through, which of the things we experienced, we felt were rushed, were unfinished, were perhaps not seen, not experienced in their fullest, because Blizzard had to start cutting some corners after being pushed to release the expansion perhaps earlier than expected. Now we are some 2 months into the expansion, so we might have forgotten, but remember that even before we knew about the release date of Dragonflight, many people were expecting, they were predicting Dragonflight to be released around March, around end of winter / start of spring of 2023. A release on 2022 was considered a funny, but a little bit out of tune joke. Nobody was expecting the expansion to be released in 2022. So definitely, if we go by what we knew and what we expected months ago in Shadowlands for this expansion, the idea that this expansion has been rushed is definitely still there, because our expectations were for this expansion basically to not even be released right now on the 26th of January. Right now, we would still be talking about the beta changes, basically. Right now, we would likely still be talking about a video on the beta talent tree changes of Guardian Druid, right? Actually, never mind, Guardian Druid would not have gotten changes to their talent tree in the beta. The 74th change to the talent tree of Priest. That's what we will be talking about right now, not on being 2 months into the expansion and getting our first patch of the expansion. So with this possible theory in mind, of course, nothing is confirmed. This is just the statement of one, at this point, ex-employee of Blizzard. It does not constitute the truth. We can't take it as a guaranteed fact. What we are doing now is simply entertaining the possibility. So if we entertain the possibility and we were to be looking at what did we see in game that confirmed this truth, in my opinion, we could start by the balancing of the dungeons. I think it's quite obvious that the older dungeons were left to be a little bit easier, a little bit underlooked, okay? Underlooked compared to the newer dungeons, which were, on the other hand, a little bit overloaded in how they were balanced. I think that would have gone through a little bit better if the expansion came out, for example, 3 months later. Which is also one thing we lamented about from the beta, the fact that Mythic Plus wasn't nearly testable enough compared to what we were expecting, for example. Another point of contention might be, for example, the crafting orders. Crafting orders came to be testable in the beta very, very late. We only had a handful of weeks of being able to test the crafting orders, and on top of that they were barely even testable because, as we noticed now, nobody basically uses the public crafting orders anyways. So we didn't even know at the time that the meta of the crafting orders would have just been private crafting orders anyways. So that is something also that is likely gone missing in terms of testing, that came out perhaps a little bit too early. We have also a few questions, but perhaps now we are sort of mind gaming ourselves. Perhaps these are just Blizzard mistakes. It doesn't necessarily mean that if we gave them 3 more months of beta testing, then Blizzard would have, fixed them. For example, Primal Chaos. For example, concentrated and normal primal infusions. The problem we have right now, which we start players see requesting more and more often, what do we do with all of these hundreds, if not thousands, of primal chaoses on our mains? We have nothing to spend them on, we have nothing to use them for. Meanwhile, our alts are begging for them, our alts are starving for primal chaos. Perhaps a little bit more testing would have made Blizzard more aware of this, would have made Blizzard, for example, create a vendor for Primal Chaos. For example, you could have converted Primal Chaos into a bind on account item, perhaps at something like a 10-to-5 rate. So use 10 Primal Chaos to turn them into 5 bind on account Primal Chaos to send your alts, and also add some other items, some other perhaps currency, perhaps some other materials you could buy, for example, with Primal Chaos, just to give you more ways to make this currency viable, to give you more ways, to give you, for example, desire, incentive to keep going into Mythic Plus, since Mythic Plus can give you a buttload of Primal Chaos. That is something perhaps that could have happened with more testing. Besides that though, I don't think there is too much. I have been hearing, of course I haven't tested it myself too much, but I have been hearing lots of praise about the gearing system for PvP. Apparently, again, don't quote me on this, apparently it's the best gearing system PvP has ever had, or at the very least has ever had in a while, so plenty of praises on that regard. We have gotten plenty of praises about the open world system when it comes to things like the Renown, when it comes to things like the open world event, whether or not it's the Maruk Hunts or it's the feast, the community feast over at the Tuskars, or if it was the siege of Dragonbane Keep, as well as a few other things like the Primal Storms introduced quite early into the expansion. So the open world is still quite lively, you still have quite a few things to do in the open world. Even if this expansion were to be rushed out, it looks like the open world is doing quite well so far. This patch even introduced the trading post to give you even more things to do in the open world, so that looks to be doing fine. The raid didn't look particularly rushed, didn't look particularly under or over-tuned, so that also looks like to be quite decent. We might say in the end perhaps a few things about professions. Besides the already mentioned crafting orders, perhaps a few professions might have had a bit more tuning and made them a little bit more useful, or perhaps trying to make a little bit more of an obvious way to level your professions, to level your skill tree of your professions in a little bit more of an obvious way, to prevent players to sort of spend point while being clueless and then realize later they completely messed up the way they wanted to level up their profession, and having no way to reset, to restart your profession skill points. That might have been a thing which perhaps with more testing Blizzard might have looked at again before the release of the expansion, but again, it's not that major. So far, I think mostly the complaints are aimed at engineering as a particularly disappointing profession so far. So I think that even if we were to look at this statement of the Dragonflight expansion being, a little bit rushed out after the devs had been pressured to an early release to get the expansion out in 2022, there are not that many instances, there are not that many points which we still can see right now as a clear point, like, yeah, I can totally see this feature being way too early, I can totally see this feature needing some 3 more months worth of testing before it were to be released. That is the clear clue. That is what we can point out at being the proof that the expansion was rushed out. I think there aren't too many instances of something like that so far in Dragonflight. With this being said, I think the experiences of Brian Birmingham were an interesting read and also a bit of a sad read based on the situation of the devs and what they have been going through in these past couple of years, and I hope the situation might improve. And I am going to leave you at the end of this video with a question, of course, related to the point in this video, which is, what do you think? And if you do, which do you think were the features that might have proven this expansion to be released too early? If you think that some of the features of Dragonflight might have been released in a much better state if Blizzard had 2 to 3 to maybe even 4 more months worth of developing time before the expansion were to be released. Besides this question, it's time to leave each other on this Thursday. As usual, we start by departing by thanking my Patreon supporters for the contribution and the support to the growth of this channel. You can still support in other ways that don't include having to take away money for your favorite e-girl simp fund. Liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to this channel, are perfectly fine ways to show your support for free. More support for free can be given by following me on Twitter, right over at this link, as well as other useful links, including the one to my stream, which will be going live again this weekend for sure, after something you will see in a couple of days. The stream usually goes live at 10 PM Central European Time, 1 PM Pacific, and 4 PM Eastern US time zones. With this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, it's good that the pain is not that strong anymore. It's bad that we still don't know what it's caused by, and that sometimes it's still kind of there.